ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last presentation of the year from RAUSI, but not the last presentation ever, because we've got a reasonably good program signed up for next year. But before we go any further, just two housekeeping items. Number one, on behalf of RAUSI and the board, I'd like to wish everybody a safe and peaceful holiday season coming up, and hope that whatever else it is, it will be stress-free. In terms of protocol tonight, we're going to crack on, and I will be introducing our speaker momentarily. But the protocol for questions is simply, if you have a question, raise the hand, which is in the reaction bar along the bottom of your screen, or type in the discussion box, "I have a question." No need for you to type a Dickens novel for your question. I'll let you say it. And I'll just go down in order of whoever is there first gets to put their question first. So with that, we'll charge ahead. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Geoff Jackson. He's a professional of international relations and military history at Mount Royal University. When he's not doing that, he is working with the Joint Force Command in Naples for NATO on issues pertaining to the Sahel. His fields of interest and research there concern post-conflict settlement and means of developing relevant policy that can be implemented by parties to the conflict and advance international peace and security. He holds a PhD in military and strategic studies from the University of Calgary, as well as a master's in strategic studies and a bachelor's in history. Without further ado, I will pass the floor over to Geoff. Geoff, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you for showing up for this talk. It's a bit of a change. I'll be talking about the G5 Sahel, what that is, why it's important, how it's going to affect NATO's southern flank, and sort of the knock-on effects that we'll have from this organization in the coming years. All right, so the G5 Sahel is an interesting organization. It represents a brand new, or it did at least in 2017, represent a brand new idea. The Sahel is a region of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, and Mauritania. The rise of VEOs and the teens led to the UN Musa mission happening there. However, Africans within this 5 countries decided that they didn't want international players coming in to try to determine how security would be run. They came up with an organization known as the G5 Sahel. And it was initially met with a lot of fanfare, both in Africa, but also a broader range from the West as well. It relied on 5,000 soldiers to fight terrorism, organized crime, and VOs in 3 major areas. As I have here on the map, you could see the 3 areas broken up to where they were going to be fighting. This area from 2015 to now in 2022 has seen a huge increase in what's labeled as violent extremist organizations, or VEOs. The G5 Sahel launched its first operation in 2017. One of the initial problems, however, of this African-led initiative was not all of the 5 countries viewed hunting down VEOs as their main priority. Internal power struggles and coups took a lot of the money and forces that had been designated for working or for challenging these VEOs, and instead used it on internal domestication. Really focused on internal instability. Most G5 countries are operationally weak and do not have strong leadership. And some of the countries, though they signed on initially, have never taken part in a mission. Burkina Faso is a case study. The hundreds of millions of dollars coming in from international organizations to prop up this organization were used to help quell public discontent in their countries. They've had a series of coups over the years and huge human rights abuses from their military within these coups as well. So this initial response to this African-led first initiative began to backfire within 2 years of it operating. The financial viability of the G5 Sahel as well has always been something that has come under threat. Most of these countries are struggling to pay their own military. So when they have this internal funding coming in, they use it to pay their military, but they're not using it to work on other issues that might stem the violent extremist organizations. External donations for the G5 Sahel to survive come largely from the European Union, France, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. America bilaterally gives money to these 5 countries individually, but not to the G5 itself as an organization. The money that comes is not enough for it both to be spent on the military and to be spent on trying to quell or limit these violent uprisings and to try to track down VEOs. And so that money was not parceled out or used correctly. Strings attached to the money didn't allow it to go to where it had to go. The EU, France had a lot of different ways that this money had to be spent. And because human rights were not being respected, this money was largely held up and not divvied out, though it was there in a bank account. The G5 was not able to access it. As I said before, the United States does give money indirectly to these 5 countries. However, they get to decide how they spent it, and largely the G5 Sahel was ignored. All right. So this area that we're looking at is absolutely massive. And as you could see here, you could see where the G5 Sahel was operating. You could see where EU missions are operating here. You could see where France was operating under their larger Operation Barkhane, which was about 5,000 people as well. And the MINUSMA mission of the UN also operating in this area. Now, this is a map from November of 2020. These missions do not exist anymore in any meaningful fashion. France has moved out. They don't have troops deployed here anymore across the whole of the region. The MINUSMA mission is winding down, has huge amounts of troops that have been pulled out. In the EU missions, are capacity building missions, so not necessarily peace building or peacekeeping missions. Without the support of France or the UN, these ones are on life support. So all we have currently is a G5 Sahel of 5,000 troops operating in a peace building, peacekeeping role. However, as you can see, they're very limited to where they're going to be operating. You can see here by the red dotted lines, the areas they are operating, and they're not really moving for that. And we're going to get to a punchline here that in May of 2022, Mali is going to say, we're done with the G5 Sahel. And if you notice, 2 out of the 3 areas where they're operating is in Mali. So it's going to very much limit the scope that the G5 Sahel can do. In its creation, the G5 Sahel was supposed to be an international group made up of all 5 of these countries that would not have to stop at borders, that could chase terrorists or organized crimes where they saw them going. This, however, in practice was never the case. This area is absolutely massive, and though there are political borders for these 5 countries, this is not how ethnic, cultural, or religious communities view the Sahel. There's a huge transient population that moves across it that doesn't identify or recognize these borders. At the same time, many of these G5 countries cannot project their power beyond regional areas within their own countries and largely beyond their capital cities in any meaningful sense. That means that this is a huge geographic area that is not being being patrolled and the G5 does not have any meaningful access to. As one commander of a G5 force out of Burkina Faso said, right now, we don't really know where we're going to be fighting against. We don't know what the G5 Sahel is. So even in missions where this is happening, where it's been designated a G5 Sahel mission, because of the lack of operational control going on, the lack of meaningful leadership from top down, these national armies are not sure what is going on, what their mandate is, or how they're going to be responding to these issues. So the G5 Sahel has been very limited in how it's going to respond to areas that are going up. At this same time, it's crucial that there's some sort of peace building or some sort of protection going on here. As France, the EU, and the UN pull out of the region, there is no effective ways or means of combating trans-border VO operations that are happening in the region. All right. So some of these countries in the Sahel have been taking the money coming in and really taking advantage of using this term terrorism and hunting down VEOs to really consolidate their powers through repressive policies. In some of these countries, there's a ruling ethnic or cultural class. And when different groups do not share that or do not identify in the same way and start to protest, the money coming in, the military aid coming into the G5 Sahel has been used to cut down on them. However, because this was seen as an African first endeavor and it had a lot of positivities there, key partners continued to support the G5 Sahel despite their poor human rights record. This type of collaboration not only has a negative effect on the quality of national and regional ownership, it also tends to incentivize local strongmen, warlords, to maintain their policy of repression and avoid reforms that these countries need, that the G5 needs to de-escalate the conflict, knowing that the survival of their oppressive regimes would be supported by Western countries. One of the things that the G5 had promised to do, and one of the key things that it wanted to do when it first came into creation, was capacity building. However, that said, it has really spent its money on the security approach. So other endemic problems such as poverty, inequality in governance, that does fuel this violence, it does fuel the growth of the VOs, has largely been ignored for a military response instead. Unlike other security regimes in the area, the G5 Sahel on paper boasts a comprehensive approach against terrorism that focuses on challenges such as economic development, democracy, and good governance. However, in practice, this is definitely not the case for most of the countries here. As time has passed, security has become more important because it attracts more attention from the international community. This idea that how do we stop the VOs? How do we stop the VOs from going up north? How do we stop them from crossing the Mediterranean? If they could somehow be kept down in the Sahel through security means, this is what the international community has really been working on. That said, I have a little chart here to my right that shows some of the projects that have been started. However, this is largely a small drop in the bucket of money that's been coming in, and the money that for the G5 from these different countries has largely been spent on internal security issues. All right. As I said on the previous slide, G5 Sahel, in theory, has a civilian component charged with mainstreaming and supervising the protection of civilians and human rights and their missions on the task force. However, this civilian component for the G5 Sahel has not yet been operational. As a UN report said on the G5, a recent report by the UN Secretary General has confirmed that on the 19th of May 2018, elements of the Malian armed forces under the command of the Joint Force of the Group of Five for the Sahel reportedly killed at least 12 civilians during an operation carried out in retaliation for the killing of one of their elements in Buseki Mapti region. At times, elements of the G5 Sahel have been hit squads that have targeted civilians. Due to impunity, lack of civilian control, training, and professionalism, these security forces in the Sahel have been involved in activities such as extortion, harassment, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture, repression, and coup d'etats. So the mandate of hunting down VOs has been changed for what these individual countries, or some of these individual countries, wish to focus on. Now, in 2022, in May of this year, Mali said that it was withdrawing from the G5 Sahel and that it was cutting ties with the French and EU. And it's actually been filling in that security gap with the Russian Wagner group. This will cause a significant reconfiguration of alliances in the region. And it's suspected that the G5 Sahel will stop to function. Mali said that maneuvers of an extra-regional state desperately seeking to isolate Mali was the reason why it's pulling out of the G5 Sahel. Many experts believe that's pointed at France and that Mali was trying to say that France is manipulating what's happening. France has fired back and said that because it was being critical of the human rights in Mali, that Mali decided to pull out and stop having international players in there. As I said, with this vacuum in security in Mali, it would seem that the Wagner group is moving in to provide security for at least this country. So with Mali pulling out, if I could go back to one of the first slides I showed here, two of the borders of the G5 Sahel are on Mali. Two of the areas that they're working at are Mali. If Mali is not allowing the G5 Sahel to operate in this region anymore, it really seems like the G5 as it is right now is not going to survive. First of all, we should probably correctly call it, moving into 2023, the G4 Sahel. But as it's split apart, as Mali is a key linchpin here, it's hard to see how this endeavor is going to continue. If it is, we need to, the G5 Sahel needs to focus beyond the security dimension. It needs to help with economic development, much needed support for democracy and civil society, something that was in their mandate when they were originally created. However, as I said, the G5 Sahel countries, or many of them, tend to perpetuate human rights abuses with impunity. This obviously reinforces frustration and resentment among the victims and survivors who might join these terrorist groups and undermine the possibilities of constructive engagement between the security forces and communities. That said, there are no other groups right now, international organizations, with a meaningful foothold in the Sahel that would help to deliver these sorts of resources that are needed critically for stability in the region and for long-term stability in the region. So the Mali's withdrawal from the G5 Sahel has been a major setback. The president of Niger recently said that the G5 is dead. That said, there are a number of critical assessments by the G5 Sahel, by the UN, by the African Union that are all coming out in 2023 seeing what can be done about the G5 Sahel, seeing what could be done about bringing some sort of international force to help with stabilization in the region. One of the issues with this region is that there has been large UN missions here since 2013, and the situation has only become worse. So it seems that peace-building operations in this area are actually not helping at all, and that there is a larger growing discontent among the populations of this region. One of the bright stars about the G5 Sahel and why it was excitedly met at the beginning was it was an African first initiative coming from the African countries themselves, and it was not being mandated on them by the international community and forced on the population, that it was coming from the groundwork up. However, over the last 7 years, it has had a number of setbacks and failures, with the linchpin of the G5 leaving. It doesn't seem likely that this organization is going to last into 2023 in the future. However, something needs to be done in this area if there is going to be stability in the future moving forward. Perhaps a more robust multinational joint task force that is African-led, perhaps the African Union can do something. Bilaterally, there's countries working with these countries independently. However, it's incredibly unstable politically, so it's hard for bilateral countries to work with it, as there's been a series of coups, 7 coups in this region over the last 3 years. So the stability of the leadership, the stability of the military is a very risky thing to become engaged in if you're going to have a regime change that might have extremely different values than what you're willing to help support, what you're willing to help aid. Now, I know I've been talking for about 25 minutes, so I'm going to stop here because I'm hoping I've raised enough ideas that we could have a robust debate about what's happening in the region, where it could be going in the future, what could possibly see some bright stars going ahead, and what might be some critical challenges to the Sahel region. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geoff. Fascinating issue, a very challenging issues, I should say. And while I wait for questions from others, I was beaten to the punch by my boss, Brigadier General Greg Mitchell. Sir, you're on the floor.
First of all, thanks, Jeffrey. That was that's fascinating. It's a lot of information to absorb and take in an area that we sometimes read about, but very superficially. Most of us just knowing that there is a problem and that Canada has been involved for a year or so in Mali, and since then, of course, crickets. But fascinating update. Thank you so much. I've got a couple of questions maybe you can help me out with. I've come across this before in an African first sort of thing. Unfortunately, it was used in Sudan when we were trying to get in, and they weren't willing to accept Western countries as part of a peacekeeping force, a UN peacekeeping force, until eventually they were told, well, they have to because we don't work that way. But I'm wondering where the African Union Peace and Stability Organization is in all this. If we talk about an African first initiative, this doesn't sound like a continental issue. This sounds like a local 5-country initiative that is not working because most don't participate and don't really believe what they're doing. It's a money grab, a power grab, and so forth. Where does the African Union stand on it? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I absolutely do, because that's the obvious question that I asked myself as well. Where's the African Union? They also have a peacekeeping organization. They also have a lot of pull here. The African Union has largely said, we're not doing anything here. We're not sending peacekeepers here. Though they will talk about it and they'll release resolutions about that, they're not giving any money. They're not willing to commit any troops there. And they've largely been hands-off and just watched MINUSMA operate there, and they'll send troops that way through the UN missions, but will not take ownership themselves of this region. And as you correctly identified, it's largely 5 failed states who are happy to take the money, but they're going to spend the money how they want to see it, and they're going to use it for causes that will help them individually, but won't actually stop the systematic or systemic issues there. So I guess quickly saying the African Union has no official policy in helping the G5 Sahel, either as an organization or really trying to engage with the growing numbers of VEOs in that area.
May I continue with a follow-up, Mr. Chair? Okay, given that the African Union is not kind of willing to get involved, and to be a bit of a cynic, is this not a case then of Africans very wisely watching the international community trip all over themselves, trying to solve something that has a sexy tag on it because it's counterterrorism, that the world is sort of focused on right now, rightly or wrongly, but really is not a non-African problem per se at this stage. I mean, that's arguable, of course, but so why should the international community care when there are so many problems around the world that where organizations, countries, and so forth are in fact willing to engage?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a complex question, so I'm going to sort of try to break it down. If I'm going too fast or whatnot, I do apologize. One, because there's going to be a competition for influence there. France is absolutely losing its influence. I was just recently last week in the region, and the absolute vitriol against European countries there is pretty powerful. Filling in the gap for this vacuum on security is the Wagner Group. When I was in Chad recently, you could see them there at the other end of the airport, right across from the UN. And I hear they're operating now in Burkina Faso and Mali as well. Another issue is, yes, there are VO organizations there, but there's largely disenfranchised populations that don't have any way to engage, don't have any way of getting jobs. There's no functioning economy. The population there is going to balloon by over 75% in the next 15 years. That means also with environmental degradation, there's going to be a huge population mushroom that is going to, out of just lack of opportunity, is going to be pushed up into North Africa, and then is going to become Mediterranean and a NATO issue on its southern flank as there is a population migration, understandably so, trying to look for opportunities that's going to come, and it's going to cause security issues as well as other issues as the migration begins to move north because of this. And these 5 failed states as well, I can't say they're all failed states, but some of these failed states are going to be perpetrating huge human rights crimes as governments try to stay in power illegitimately.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Well, I have a question for General Mitchell. If you agree that there was some degree of success in Sudan, can we identify the root source or root sources of that success? And are those root sources absent in the Sahel?
I would suggest, first of all, that the very initiation of a ceasefire was based on a exhaustion after 20 years of a civil war and millions of people dead. So nobody really intervened other than humanitarian organizations before that time frame. It just allowed them to exhaust and play themselves out. And they developed their own ceasefire arrangement over 2.5 years, the two sides, without a lot of international interference, well, without any international interference, just help and guidance and support. So that kind of set the stage, first of all. And then when the UN did go in and provided the peacekeeping force, It was probably one of the first integrated and complex peacekeeping missions. By that time, it was the largest and most expensive of its kind. And I think what is probably seems to be lacking from Geoff's very fine explanation there is that because it was an integrated mission, it was driven by very clear civilian oversight, and all of the elements that are needed: political affairs, civilian affairs, so forth, humanitarian affairs. So the military was actually doing what it was supposed to do, which is creating a secure environment for the ceasefire agreement to be put in place and implemented, and for the rest of the missions to do their job. And I could expand, if you wanted, on the actual military role and why it succeeded in the Joint Military Commission. But I don't want to take over the whole conversation here. This is Jeffrey's podium, and I think there are questions for him. But different situation, but until in the Sahel, my assessment after a 25-minute briefing on it, thank you, Jeffrey, was essentially there's no peace to keep, there's no will, there's no capability right now. So there's going to be a fair bit of exhaustion, fighting, death, and disruption for some time to come, I would suggest, unless the situation changes and real support, not just throwing money at it, comes from somewhere, whether it be a multinational joint task force or something. It's got to be a complex and integrated one, in my opinion. But thank you so much for the opportunity to answer that.
Well, while I'm waiting for the next question, you can compare the Sahel.
I have, Joe, sorry to interrupt. I got two questions on the meeting chat where individuals didn't want to ask a question orally.
But let them charge ahead.
All right, so I'll ask Crystal's first because I think it's the first question I was asked. In terms of peace building, obviously what has worked in the past is not working today. I'm wondering, are the peacekeepers there talking to the people to find out what these are? I've noticed that Calgary here has shelters. What needs similar like housing, jobs, filling the gap for workers who seem to be disorganized? Yeah, that's a very broad question. One of the things I would respond to that is the UN has had a massive peacekeeping mission there for the last 9 years, and it is really integrated as the UN has, and has a lot of different components, and has thousands and thousands of employees trying to do this. However, from my research and my analysis, it's getting lip service from many of these governments. Many of these governments are taking the resources, and though the resources are tied with strings, they're able to take that. They're able to take those resources and just spend it on what they have. It's a very undeveloped area, so there's a lot of dead or empty space there where there is no real protection of safety, where groups could, VOs, violent extremist organizations, can come in, disrupt a town, move on, and there'll be no military or security response to that in a meaningful time. So it makes the population very distrustful of what the government can do. So if you are opening up, say you're opening up a bank, or you're opening up schools, or you're opening up or giving economic opportunities, building roads and stuff in these regions, there's not a big enough capacity and a rule of law in many of these places where that's respected. Also, it's hard to identify who's a farmer on a motorbike here, or who's potentially part of an organized drug cartel, because drugs come in from South America, they go through the Sahel, and they get punched up through North Africa into the Mediterranean, or who's a violent extremist organization, or who's a rebel who doesn't trust the government. So before we could start building sort of shelters and these things, we need to have a government that is competent. We need to have civilian oversight that is competent. And then we need to have a security force that can respond in a meaningful manner. Hopefully, Crystal, that answers your question. The next question I have from Bill is, relationship between the Sahelian countries and China. Yeah, China is absolutely there. One of the things when talking to individuals there about China is that China could play a long game that bilaterally Western countries can't. So where Western countries are sort of have a 2-3 year policy, the Chinese government or individual Chinese businesses who I can't point to if they're supported or not by the Chinese government are flooding into the region, are bringing a lot of money and resources into the region. And from outside analysis, it seems like a money losing proposition. But what I would suspect is happening is that they're gaining influence, and it's not something that they're gaining in a short term 1 to 5 years. It's something that where they're playing a long game, where 15, 20 years, they're going to be building up that influence. When I talk to individuals there about, say, how the Chinese government's working to compare to the Canadian government, there's not a distinction that one is better than the other. All international governments are met with a level of distrust, but what's being brought in is going to be largely taken. So it's not that Canada is seen as better in this region than another country. And then a lot of European countries are viewed with, not viewed very well. France being among them currently.
So maybe a follow-up to that, Geoff. Do you see China, obviously through the Belt and Road, that's most of the development activity that's going on.
Yeah.
Do you see them realizing now that they're going to have to put military forces in to protect those long-term investments? Are they getting basically sucked into protection of their own economic assets that they're trying to build?
No, I don't see that. I have anecdotal evidence that individuals from China, I can't say it's the Chinese government, individuals from China are bribing a lot of the security forces there to help protect their interests. So one example was when I was in the Sahel, there'd be trucks coming in that were bringing in goods from China, and the front end of the back of the truck would have those goods. But behind those goods would be alcohol, would be other stuff that they would be bribing and trading. So I cannot see China itself having its own sort of peace building operation there, or having some sort of mercenary group like the Wagner group there. I think they're going to go at it a different way. The one thing that I've been amazed at with China and region is just how much money it could bleed and keep on going, because it's spending a ton of resources. And from the short-term perspective, I don't think it's getting value for that, but I would suspect that they have a longer game there. And especially as European powers are pulling out and no one else is filling a vacuum, I think that they're going to be well positioned, that they can transition to something like what you're suggesting. And they're just sort of waiting to see how it falls apart first before they go in to build it up.
I'm not too familiar with the region, but what kind of critical minerals and
there's a
metals
ton of minerals. So there's gold mines, there's lots of minerals, and I don't know the names of them, but for for cell phones and stuff like that. So and they're not being correctly harnessed or right now because of there's not the infrastructure there, but there are international companies that are moving in that will start to make that process better. So there's going to be a lot of wealth that could potentially come out of there. There's gold mines, and then stuff for lithium batteries and stuff like that there as well. And then there's not a lot of oil in the Sahel at all, but in Senegal and in Western Africa, there is. And as they get more high-tech ways of doing that, you could see different governments being engaged in that region.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Geoff, I don't see any other questions, so I'll jump in. Have you heard anything about the International Criminal Court doing investigations and or issuing not arrest warrants, but initiating investigations with the view that they might prosecute people for war crimes or crimes against humanity?
No, I haven't. That's not to say it doesn't exist and that they're not doing that. A lot of these governments have been falling or have had regime changes pretty quickly. And there's not a lot of international press operating in these regions, like outside of the capital cities. So it'd be interesting to see what the ICC will do in 5 to 10 years as more information comes out about what is happening. But in the immediacy of right now, I don't see the international community that concerned or with investigating the region. And there is a lack of support from the governments themselves to have that sort of spotlight turned on them. Also, bilaterally, individual countries might not want that as well, as they're trying to cobble together some sort of stability or some sort of ownership in the region.
Can you just go over that last point again? You lost me.
Yeah, sorry. So I don't want to label any countries or whatnot, but for the ICC to come in, it usually needs a more robust mandate and needs to have some political backbone behind it. And I don't see Western Europe or the West itself having that interest in the region right now.
Last question, then I'll stand down. Do you see any representation from the International Committee of the Red Cross who track those kinds, just report and track?
Yeah, the Red Cross is definitely there, and they are definitely tracking it. And when you travel through the region, you see their beat up white Jeeps driving all over the place. So they are there, and for sure they are tracking it. I haven't looked into what report the Red Cross has done, though I think I could probably find that within about 10, 15 minutes. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I got a question from Bevan. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't see him on the list.
Yeah, perfect. Is the Wagner Group operating independently, or is it acting furtherance to Russian interests? Officially, it's acting independently. And the way it's getting paid in some of these regions is by getting ownerships or stakes in the mines that are being developed. They are offering protection to the governments there for the ruling class governments in case of a military coup against them. The Wagner Group will protect leading politicians. It's also been said that the Wagner groups have been carrying out systematic killings. Obviously, the Wagner Group operating a region says they're operating independently, or at least Russia says they're operating independently and that they aren't tied to Russia. But as we've seen in Ukraine, I find it hard to believe that they aren't in conversation with the Russian government.
Last call for questions. Well, there have been none. I'll take this opportunity to say, Geoff, thank you very much for introducing many of us to a place in the world that we know too little of. And I guess we might look forward to a follow-up report from you, perhaps in 6 to 9 months. just to see what's evolved.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak here.
Thanks for stepping up under the circumstances. You're very kind and thoughtful. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes tonight's event. Look forward to seeing you early in 2023, and we'll be pushing out notification of our next presentation. Until then, again, have a stress-free holiday season and be safe. Thank you and good night.